Ladies and gentlemen, welcome along to Too Many Games. We're jumping back into our series on Epic Armageddon today, where we have a look at the rules and how to play Epic Armageddon. It's part number 9 of our series, and this is the first of 2 videos looking at the assault phase, a very critical part of the game. If you are interested in Epic Armageddon, then I suggest you check out the other videos that I've released so far, going over the rules and how to play. So let's get started today. And the best place to start is, well, what is an assault and what do we mean by that? Formations that take an engage action are allowed to take a move and then fight in an assault. However, let's just dispel the idea that this assault that you can fight in is just hand-to-hand combat. Assaults actually represent close-range engagements where troops and vehicles will fight using small arms, grenades and other weapons, including their hand-to-hand combat weapons. These assaults are a very decisive action to take in Epic and will usually end with one side either being destroyed or forced to break and withdraw. They are not for the faint of heart. On a personal note, I found that when I first learned how to play Epic Armageddon, I didn't understand their tactical significance as much and preferred to stick to shooting as my method of destroying the enemy. But as I gained more experience, I came to realize the importance of assaults and their potency in the game as well. Let's have a quick look at the design concept behind assaults in Epic Armageddon. As mentioned, assaults don't just represent hand-to-hand combat, but everything that occurs when units are ordered to assault an enemy. What the designers were trying to encapsulate in this part of the game is the feeling of an entire game of Warhammer 40k taking place in a single assault in Epic Armageddon. However, this said, the design of assaults is one that just because units are close to each other doesn't mean that it's one of them assaulting the other. And as such, assault only occurs between units that are within 15 centimeters. If, I just have to stress that if they take the engage action, okay? So you need to take the engage action to initiate an assault. They don't just happen at any other time. It doesn't matter if those units are within 10 centimeters of each other. You need to take that engage action to trigger the assault. Just being nearby isn't good enough. Let's further cement this with our first FAQ on assaults. Do assaults occur when neither player takes an engage action? And clearly, as what we've just gone over, is no, they never automatically occur. So just hammering in that fact, if you don't take an engage action, then an assault doesn't happen. So how do we make an assault? What's the procedure that we follow? Let's have a quick overall look before we dig down into the procedure in this video and in the next video too that I'll release. Step 1, you choose a target formation. Step 2, you make a charge move. Step 3, the opponent will make counter charges. That is what we'll cover today in our videos. But after this, we'll continue on in our next video with step 4, where we resolve attacks. Step 5, we work out the results of the assault. Then step 6, the loser of the assault will withdraw. And finally, step 7, the winner will consolidate. 7 steps to assault in total. And it can be a bit of work to get through depending on the situations. Depends on the number of units and formations that are involved in the assault. They can be quite full on. Okay, let's start at step 1. Choose a target formation. So a formation that takes an engage action must first choose who their target formation will be. This target can be any enemy formation and they can be located anywhere on the board. Though usually it makes sense to have them close by. It might be strange and ineffective to be too far away from where your unit is. It is possible to choose 2 or more formations that are close together as the target of the assault, but we'll look at more of this when we get to the intermingled formations special rule. Okay, now we come to step 2, make charge moves. The engage action, when taken, lets the formation take 1 move before then fighting in the assault. This charge move is nothing fancy and is simply a normal move for the formation up to their normal distance they are allowed to move. This charge can be made in any direction, and there's no specification that it has to be straight towards the target. or any other restriction like that. However, once they have completed this move, at least one unit in the assaulting formation needs to be within 15 centimeters of the target formation. If they are not, then the action ends and no assault occurs. So it is possible to fail this action, especially if you are not using rules that allow pre-measuring in the game. But only a single unit in the charging formation needs to end within 15 centimeters for it to be valid. So a few things of note when it comes to charge moves. Units making a charge move can enter the zone of control of an enemy in order to move into base contact. So normally you can't do this, but in an assault, you can in order to make it into base contact. Base contact will allow a unit to fight with its close combat value instead of its firefight value, as we will see later. It also forces the unit that you got into base-to-base contact to do the same. This is the only time that a unit can actually move within an enemy's zone of control. But there is a note here with this, is that you cannot enter the zone of control of an enemy unit that is not part of the target of the assault. So it is possible to screen formations with other units so that you just can't nip by and hit formations behind other formations necessarily. So a few more points to make on charge moves before we see an example. When moving units into contact with the enemy, a maximum of 2 units can be in base contact with each defender, regardless of whether they are infantry or vehicles. So a max of 2 in base contact. When moving into an enemy's zone of control, as soon as you do that, the unit must move into base contact with the closest enemy whose zone it entered. So you can't skirt through a zone to contact someone else. As soon as the first unit enters it, it heads straight towards that closest enemy to get that unit into base contact. However, once you have contacted that unit with your unit in base contact, the enemy will lose its zone of control for the rest of the assault. And as a result, other units can move right past it as it no longer projects this zone. Just a note as mentioned before, only a single unit has to end its charge move within 15 centimeters of the target of the charge in order for the charge to be successful and for an assault to occur. There is no compulsion to ever move into base contact unless you enter a zone of control as mentioned above. Okay, let's have a look at some examples of moving in for a charge. Firstly, we have some orc boys that are going to do an engage action and make a charge move at the tactical squad. They move up to their move distance towards the Marines, but are unable to make the full distance into base contact. However, the distance between the 2 units is now equal to or less than 15 centimeters. So that means that the charge is successful and an assault will be fought. It's just not hand-to-hand assault or combat, as the orcs would probably prefer. Okay, so we have a second example too, some more orc boys and another Marine squad. However, the distances are a little different this time, and the orc boys move up to their movement value towards the Marines. The movement gets them into base contact this time with the Marines, thankfully, and as such they can move into the zone of control of the Marines, and they cancel out their zone of control for the rest of the assault. So this is a successful assault too in this case. Okay, let's have a look at a couple of charge moves that hopefully will serve us well in understanding how they work. In this first example, we have a unit of orc boys performing another charge move, and there are 2 Marine units that are part of the same formation being charged. The orc boys charge and move through the first Space Marine's zone of control in order to engage the second unit more closely. This, however, from what we've already seen, is illegal and cannot be done like this. As soon as the orc boy entered the zone of control of the first Marine, they would have to try and get into base contact with that unit. So don't try and perform a charge move like this. Only enter zones of control if you intend to then move into base contact with that unit. Okay, let's see a second example here. This time a formation of 3 orc boys gets the drop on a unit of Space Marines and decide to engage, performing their charge move. Since the orcs are better in base contact, they move all 3 units into base contact with the Space Marines. However, as we've seen already, this is also not allowed under the rules, as only a maximum of 2 bases are able to contact each defender in base contact. Okay, let's look at the FAQs that arise from making charge moves. First question, can a unit that's making a charge move put an enemy unit in base contact if the enemy unit is in terrain that is dangerous to the charging unit? And the answer is yes. If part of the enemy unit is not in dangerous terrain, the unit can be put in base contact there without taking a dangerous terrain test. If the enemy unit is completely within the dangerous terrain, then the charging unit would have to take a dangerous terrain test. So basically, if you have to enter the terrain to get into base-to-base contact, then you'll have to take a test, a dangerous terrain test. But if you can connect somehow without entering it, then you're fine. You don't have to take the test. All right, next question. Can a unit that's making a charge move put an enemy unit in base contact if the enemy is in terrain that is impassable to the charging unit? And very similarly here, yes, if part of the enemy unit is not in impassable terrain, the unit can be put in base contact there. If the enemy unit is completely within the impassable terrain, then no. So it's very similar to the last question, only it's impassable terrain. So if you can connect with them without going into the terrain, you are fine. But if you have to go through that terrain, then you cannot connect with them. Okay, let's have a look at a question on zones of control and charging. What happens to a charging unit that enters the zone of control of an enemy unit and it does not have enough movement to make it into base contact? So basically asking if you try to get into base contact with an enemy by entering their zone of control, the rules say that you have to move straight into base contact, but if you can't make it, can you still enter the zone? The charging unit would move as much as possible towards the enemy unit. The intent of the rule is that you should not be able to charge through a zone of control to reach a unit further away, but you should always move towards the closest enemy unit, even if you cannot make it in base contact. So yes, you do move into that zone of control. Okay, last couple of questions here. Can a unit making a charge move claim the cover to hit modifier and receive a cover save against Overwatch fire? And the answer is yes and yes. So fairly simple. If you trigger Overwatch, cover still applies for your defense. Next up, after it makes a charge move, does the engaging formation need to have at least one unit with a line of fire to a unit in the target formation in order for the assault to take place? And the answer is yes. While it is not specifically stated in the rules, it is implied close enough that individual infantry are able to engage in the fight and make use of their small arms and required to resolve firefight attacks. So although it's not clearly said, you must have line of fire to initiate the assault when you end up within 15 centimeters after your charge move. If you can't see them, you can't firefight basically. Okay, so now let's move on to what happens after the charge moves occur. The defenders are not helpless in an assault and have a chance to retaliate. The defending formation in the assault is allowed to make a special move called a counter charge. This is only able to be done by defenders that have not ended up in base contact with the enemy charging them. So how far can the defenders counter charge? Well, if their movement value is 30 centimeters or more, then their counter charge can be up to 10 centimeters. If their movement value is 25 centimeters or less, then they are able to counter charge up to 5 centimeters in total. So here are some examples. The Tactical Space Marine Squad has a move value of 15 centimeters, so their counter charge move could be up to 5 centimeters. Lehman Russ Tank has a move value of 20 centimeters, so it can also counter charge up to 5 centimeters. While this Predator tank is a bit quicker with a movement value of 30 centimeters, so therefore when it countercharges, it could move up to 10 centimeters. So let's look at more on countercharges. Firstly, countercharges happen after charge moves have been completed, but also after any Overwatch shots have had an opportunity to occur as well. Secondly, when completing a countercharge, all the rules of charging apply to a countercharge move, and this countercharge move cannot take units out of their 5 centimeter coherency with each other. So they still have to stay near each other in a legal position. Next, if you have units inside transports, they can choose to disembark as their countercharge move and be placed straight into base contact with the enemy if you choose to. And lastly, and this is an important note, that there is no compulsion to countercharge. So you can do it, but you don't have to do it, and you may not want to do it with some of them. And this will depend on whether or not you think it will be better. A unit will perform better in an assault if it's in base contact, or perhaps staying out of base contact, as we will see when we get into the actual fighting of the assault. Okay, so some more on countercharges. Countercharges, when made, must be made towards the closest enemy unit. You can't just wander off in any old direction or move backwards as part of the countercharge. And it's also interesting, as we'll see in a second, about the literal interpretation of this. When you move as part of a countercharge, you can move into base contact with the enemy, but you are still held to the maximum 2 units in base contact with an enemy unit, just like the charging force was. So when moving these charges, as stated, it's towards the nearest enemy. However, this isn't towards the nearest enemy unit in the charging formation necessarily. It can be towards another formation, but has to follow the rule for nearest enemy unit still. So it doesn't have to be part of the assaulting formation. So this is something to remember and can sometimes be quite tricky and not necessarily intuitive. In fact, if somehow your defending unit manages to make contact with a different unit with its countercharge move, then that unit will be drawn into the assault as well. And in this case, treat them as a single formation with the original assaulting unit for the assault. So as the defender, you have the opportunity that you can try and potentially connect another unit in that countercharge and bring them into the fight as well. And it's one big fight in that point. Okay, let's have a look at an example to help us picture this a bit better. So in this in this example, we have 2 units of Orc Boys in a formation facing off against 2 Predator tanks. There is also an Orc Dreadnought from a different formation close by. The 2 Orc Boys assault in and manage to get one of the tanks into base contact. Now, in a real game of Epic, you probably wouldn't want your Predator tanks in base contact in an assault, but let's pretend you do for some reason, just for the purpose of this example. The second Predator tank at the rear can now make a countercharge of up to 10 centimeters because its movement value is 30 centimeters or more. However, this has to be towards the closest enemy unit, which in this case is the Orc Dreadnought. So if the tank countercharges, it will bring the Dreadnought into the assault, and the Dreadnought will count as being a single unit with the Orc Boys in the assault and fight as if it had assaulted 2. Now, you wouldn't do this in a real game as stated. You'd probably want to sit back in firefight with your tank, but this is just an example to highlight how it would work if you did want to countercharge in this particular instance. Okay, so let's explore some FAQs around countercharging. When a unit uses its countercharge, is it towards the closest enemy unit in the attacking formation or just the closest enemy unit? So I've already highlighted this here, so we'll go straight to the answer, and that is the closest enemy unit. This could be a unit from another formation. So as we said and as we saw with that Orc Dreadnought in the previous example, it doesn't have to be the assaulting formation. You're compelled to go to the closest enemy unit. Next up, if the closest enemy unit is in contact with 2 defending units, can a unit countercharge the next closest instead? And the answer is yes, it can. So if the target of the closest unit is unable to be contacted in base to base due to that restriction of 2 units in base contact, then you instead target the next closest. So you still get to do it. So continuing on, the FAQs. What happens when the closest enemy unit cannot be reached due to impassable terrain or friendly units? Their countercharge would follow the shortest path to get to the closest enemy unit. So in a case where countercharging is not possible for some reason, the intent is to try and find the shortest path and to countercharge and to do that. Okay, next, can units countercharge over friendly units? And the answer is follow the normal movement rules with respect to this. So nothing groundbreaking there. The answer is generally no, unless the unit being moved over is infantry, as you may recall from our movement video that we did earlier on in this series. Okay, some more questions coming along about countercharging still. Can units disembark from a unit that has already countercharged? Yes, so long as the transport unit isn't in base contact with two enemy units. Okay, so if your transport countercharges, then the units inside can get out of the transport at the end of that countercharge, which is quite handy, really, and makes transports quite potent potentially in a countercharge, provided that you don't countercharge into base-to-base contact with two other units. Can a unit that disembarked other units still countercharge? So can it disembark other units and then do the countercharge, as opposed to what we just read where they move and then disembark? And the answer is no. Disembarking happens at the end of a move. So as you may expect with this, if a unit disembarks from your transport as part of the countercharge process, you can't then go and countercharge with that transport after the disembarkation. Okay, so we're still going with the questions here. Can a formation that used its overwatch fire on the attacking formation still countercharge? So can you countercharge if you overwatched? Yes, you can. So overwatch doesn't impede the ability of a unit to countercharge, which is good. After countercharges are made, does the engaging formation need to have at least one unit with a line of fire to a unit in the target formation in order for the assault to take place? In the first round, yes, as all the normal charge move rules apply. In subsequent rounds, the assault is already taking place and its result must be determined. So the question is asking if the assault still takes place if there is no line of fire to any units in the target formation. And it's basically saying that it needs to exist for the first round of the assault, and we will see how it can repeat into multiple rounds in our next video. But in those subsequent rounds, you just keep fighting and countercharging as a result needs to be worked out regardless. And our very last question here, before we end this video today, what happens when an assault goes into a second round and no units are within 15 centimeters of each other after both sides have countercharged? And the answer is, you work out the result again. So if you end up fighting multiple rounds and no one is near each other, still calculate the victory as normal, as someone can still win the assault without any fighting. It's a fringe case, and it's very unlikely to happen in my opinion. In fact, I cannot recall that ever happening in any of my games, but it could happen hypothetically. Well, once again, we've made it to the end of another video in our Epic Armageddon series. I decided to cut this video in half just due to the volume of explanation and the rules that exist in the assault phase. It's a pretty decent video length already, and we're only about halfway at best. I hope you enjoyed this first part of our assault video. The next video will finish off the assault phase, so make sure you catch that one coming out soon. Feel free to like or subscribe if you want to see the rest of this series, and I'll try to respond to any comments that you might leave as well. See you next time on Too Many Games.